And finally, they convinced the state legislature to provide some money to Purdue to study modern plastic tile drainage. And so I just happened to come at the time when that money came through. So what have we found over the 40 years? Drainage improves timeliness of field work. Drainage improves crop yields. Drainage improves cover crop growth and other conservation practices and allows those to work better. I'm going to talk in just a little more detail about all of those. Drainage certainly is a long-term investment, but there are trade-offs. So as much of a proponent of adequate drainage as I am, we also have to keep in mind that there are trade-offs. One of the big ones is water quality, and I'll talk just briefly about that. When we more intensively drain, we have the chance to more intensively lose nitrogen in the drainage water, which we don't want. And then there is an economic balance of spacing, right? We don't put tiles every foot apart because that wouldn't make sense economically, right? But how close or how far apart do we need to put them? So just one slide or so on each of those points. Drainage improves timeliness of field work, which for many farmers is really crucial. If you can get into the field a day earlier than if you didn't have the drains, that could mean the difference between planting this week or planting 2 weeks away because it rains in between, okay? So during the first 10 years of our experiment, we had different drainage spacings without going into all the details, but how close did we put the tiles together? And they were each treated when they were ready. When the farm superintendent thought he could chisel the field, he did. And then we planted the next day. And so the undrained control plots that we had were delayed anywhere between only a day, because once it dried out and everything was plantable, to 15 days, because maybe the narrow spacing plots were ready to plant, but the undrained wasn't, and then it rained, okay? And then the undrained got dried out almost close enough to plant, and then it rained again, okay? So a couple of years, we had a 2-week delay for the undrained spacing. So that kind of more timely access to the field is really a major benefit to most farming operations, okay? Because you can get in and get it planted. This is just a nice illustration from a Google photo. It wasn't during the planting season. This was at the end of February one year, but the farm superintendent hand drew in these blue lines to indicate where our tile drains are. And you can see where the tile drains are really close together. You can see this light gray color indicating that the soil had been drying out, right? It was draining adequately. In these dark, almost black areas, there are no tiles, and you can see that the soil was remaining wetter, and thus a much darker color on this aerial photo. So the first question really of the study from when we set it up was, will tile drains work on this field? And the answer is clearly yes, they are draining excess water, and that gave us a lot of benefits. Drainage definitely improved crop yields. This is the corn yields averaged over this period. There were about 24 corn years out of that 33 years or so, because we had continuous corn for a while. We had corn soybeans for a while. And you can see the undrained control here was 144 bushels per acre average over all of the corn years, whereas any of the treatments that we considered to have drainage were in the 160s. Okay, so we had clearly a significant yield benefit where we had drainage compared to where we didn't. If you just look at the raw number, you'll see that the very narrowest spacing, which is unrealistic for that soil, but the very narrowest spacing had the highest yield, but certainly not the best economics, right? Because that additional yield did not pay for the additional tile. And so Michael Langenmeyer, an ag economist, has done some economics work with my study, and this is just one of them. He's showing here the 66-foot or 20-meter spacing, which basically was determined to be the best optimum of economics, okay? Intensity of drainage, but also yield benefit. And these two lines are simply showing the the blue line is the 66-foot or 20-meter spacing, and the dashed line is the undrained control, showing over the course of the experiment the average difference in the gross or the gross revenue. The average difference in the gross revenue over this entire period was $60 an acre. You can see there was more differences in the later years because the soil was because the rainfall patterns were even greater, and the soil where we had drainage had been improving. But basically, he's done more elaborate economics as well. But this kind of tells you the main story here. All right, besides getting into the field and besides overall yield, corn, what else is there that helps make drainage pay? One of them is that it improves cover crop growth. So later in the experiment, we started using cover crops, primarily after corn initially, but then we started doing it after both crops. This is one example of a year where we were going to be planting soybeans, so we let the cover crop grow a little more. Plus, it was a very wet year. We were having trouble getting in to terminate the cover crop. But you can see here, this is cereal rye cover crop. In the tiled portion of the field, we had about 3,100 pounds of top growth per acre of that cover crop on May 13th, right before we were going to go in and spray it. On the untiled area, you can see we have good stand, right? So we have plants, but they're just kind of puny, right? They're just not doing really well. And they had less than a fourth of the growth that the drained one did. So the point here is, if you're going to take time and money to plant a cover crop, you're doing that because you want it to do something for you, right? Whether it's to scavenge nitrogen or to improve soil health, whatever it is. And so drainage is going to make a big difference if it's a poorly drained, if it's a naturally poorly drained soil. You need to have drainage first if you want to have good cover crop growth. Drainage enables other conservation practices to work better. So if you have a naturally poorly drained soil, in other words, a high water table soil, conservation practices, not only the cover crops that I just showed you, but no-till and rotation with hay crops and all of those things, they're going to be much more effective in increasing your crop yields and improving those soil physical properties where you have tile versus where you don't. So adequate drainage really is a necessary first step to improving crop yields and soil health. Agronomic practices alone aren't likely to make up for inadequate drainage. And I really stress this because sometimes when we're talking to folks who don't necessarily have a full concept of why we use drainage, sometimes they'll say, well, all farmers need to do is use no-till and cover crops and they won't need those tile drains. And I vigorously debate against that. Okay, I basically say, no, that's not quite right. Where we need drainage is where we have a high water table because we have a restricting layer down at 3 or 4 feet that holds water up. And so we need to remove that excess water in the spring in order to plant our crops. And we need that excess water removed in order for cover crops to grow well and in order for no-till to work well. It's true that cover crops and no-till then increase the permeability or the infiltration of the surface soils, right? The top foot or two. But the water that we're draining with drainage is the water that gets down to 3 feet and just sits there. So in my opinion, if we want to improve soil health, but we have a naturally poorly drained soil, high water table soil, we need to take care of the drainage first, and then we can really improve soil health in these other ways. Now, one of the trade-offs that I mentioned is water quality. As we put drains closer together, they remove more water from the field faster, right? That's the whole reason. If we bring tiles closer and closer together in a field, that means they remove more water from the field faster during that wet period. So that means that whatever those drains are carrying, there will be more of that lost as well. And the main nutrient that gets lost by tile drainage is nitrate, okay? So this is just some of our the earliest work. I don't have time to go into all the other results we've had over the last 35 years, but in the early time period where we had high fertilizer nitrogen rates and no cover crop, just continuous corn, you see here that our 20 meter or 66-foot spacing lost about 23 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year coming out the drains. As we brought the drains closer together, we lost more water per acre, which means it carried more nitrogen per acre. So the 10-meter spacing lost about 33, and the 5-meter or 16-foot spacing lost about 44 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year coming out the drain. That's a lot, and that was typical for the time in the Midwest. We're doing better than that now, but the point is that point still holds, that as we bring tile drains closer together, we lose more nitrate because we lose more water. So the bottom line on the drainage is that the drain spacing matters, both for yields as well as for water and nitrate loss. Excess rainfall matters. I didn't talk about that today, but you can imagine as we get more rainfall during the winter, when we have drainage, we're going to lose more water and more nitrate. Fertilizer rate and form are still important. I didn't talk about that today either. Cover crops reduce those nitrate concentrations and loads, and that's been one of the main findings from our drainage project. So my bottom line when I talk about drainage and intensifying drainage, I urge people that if they are intensifying drainage on their field, if they feel they need more drainage in their field than what they currently have, we also need to intensify management of other aspects of that system. And one of the big ones is cover crops. I didn't show you our cover crop drainage data, but I think I will actually today. And that is one way of doing it. Controlled drainage is another. Basically, the soil is a leaky system. Whether you have tile drains or not, it's a leaky system. And so if you're going to put in more tile drains, then you also want to do something else that will help reduce the amount of nitrate that's getting to that tile drain in the first place. And cover crops is one big way of doing that. So if you want more details on this rather short presentation of what I did drainage-wise, what we did drainage-wise, I do have some videos and some extension publications. They say the same thing. It's just, would you rather read or would you rather listen? They changed the website on me, so now the best thing to do is just to Google Purdue CPAC drainage, and you'll find these summaries. So let's shift to a little bit more discussion about soil health. NRCS has been really promoting soil health and all of the conservation partners in Indiana. And we might define it as the continued capacity of the soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. A couple points to make here. One is that it's the continued capacity, right? So we're looking long-term, not just the capacity today. Function, I don't know how often you think about the fact that we ask the soil to do a lot of functions for us, to do a lot of things for us. And in this case, we're looking at it as functioning as an ecosystem that sustains us and provides us with food. There's a lot of things you might look at when you're looking at what characterizes a healthy soil. And here's a list of some of those, right? We need to have water get into the soil as opposed to run off. We need some of that water to be stored for future use. We want the soil to resist erosion and crusting. We want it to filter contaminants, whether those be nutrients that have been specifically applied or whether there's a waste disposal going on. We want it to filter. We need good rooting depth for the crop that we have. We need trafficability, adequate aeration for roots, and nutrient availability for our crops. I'm sure some of you have seen this depiction from NRCS on soil health principles. And again, here we're focusing on what's the principle behind different practices that we do. You may do a practice, but the practice is going to be different whether you're growing corn, soybean, hay, vegetables, whatever you're doing. But what are the principles that are similar behind it? First thing is to minimize disturbance. Often this is no-till, but not always. Basically, try to minimize that disturbance of the soil. Maximize soil cover. No-till might be one way of doing that. Cover crops might be one way of doing that. Maximizing biodiversity, as opposed to just having corn or corn soybeans. Try to have something else in there, whether it's a cash crop or a cover crop. And then provide continuous living roots for as much of the year as possible, okay? We may not have living growing roots in January and February, but we could certainly have living growing roots longer than we do in a typical corn soybean rotation, where we have something growing for 4 months or maybe 5. So what are some of those practices that are used to fulfill the principles related of soil health? One of them is cover crops. It takes care of 3 of those 4 principles, right? It basically is covering the soil and providing biodiversity and providing roots. Cover crops can be used even if you disturb the soil, right? Even if you till the soil, you can still grow cover crops, but it's one of our big features. No-till is a way of minimizing disturbance. That's one of the big practices that will help improve soil health. Extended crop rotations. This is from that regional project I talked about, where they simply, had corn, soybean, wheat rotation in their experiment, and that's not particularly extended, but it's more extended than a lot of fields in Indiana, right, that have just corn, soybeans. Okay, it's a third crop, so it's already providing a little more diversity to our rotation. And then perennials are one of the best things we can do if it fits into our system, right? Whether it's grazing out in Kansas, or whether it's grazing in Indiana for dairy, or whether it's cutting hay, making hay from our perennials. They've got roots growing for a lot longer, a lot more continuous. We're not disturbing the soil, the field every year, right? We may have 2-3 years of the same crop. So that's a great way to improve soil health where it can be worked into a system. Besides soil health for growing plants, soil health is also important for those, for all of us as taxpayers, as we're paying our county taxes, and part of our county taxes may go to cleaning out ditches that have filled in with sediment that eroded off of somebody's farm or somebody's construction site. But this is an example that some of you will have seen, a slake test demonstration where it's the same soil type, a clod of soil that was put into a cylinder of water. And the one that was from a tilled field with no cover crops, as soon as it hits the water rushes in. There's nothing to hold that soil together. It just breaks down, kind of melts. Think of erosion in the field. The soil just breaks apart and washes away. A field of the same soil type that had cover crops and no-till, the water rushed in, but air was able to escape, and there were microbial glues that were holding those soil particles together. So from the standpoint of just water quality in the ditches that don't have to be cleaned out, soil health is a big benefit. For those of you who might be interested in more detail in that, this report that came out a few years ago now was called Turning Soils into Sponges, and it's about just exactly what it says, right? Making our soils more absorbent, more able to handle that rainfall coming in, and holding on to that rainfall. Basically, the report analyzed over 150 different field experiments from around the world that included perennials, cover crops, no-till, and other practices. And it found that you got increased water infiltration and decreased runoff and increased soil water holding capacity. So you had more water for crop use in drought years, and you had less runoff and flooding in both wet and dry years, where you had more cover. The continuous living cover was the best, but cover crops were a close behind in their ability to improve this. All right, so let's talk a little more detail about cover crops. And I always like to kind of start and back up by saying, well, what's the overall rationale for cover crops? It's to have something living and growing at times that we typically don't. Okay. So we're already into May right now. So things are, growing and everything else. But if I had been talking with you in March, your grass on your lawns might have started greening up, but we were not planting in our fields yet. Right. So we're basically saying that we want to capture sunlight and feed soil organisms and sequester carbon, trap and recycle nutrients, and improve soil health, and basically make better use of the resources and the time and the sunlight that we do have available. This picture illustrates that same concept. This was the Purdue Agronomy farm a number of years ago. It was a year that had a particularly early harvest, so this was early September, and the corn and soybean plots had already been harvested in this particular experiment, and they're brown. They're brown all fall, winter, spring. The grass strips, not even a cover crop, right? Just the grass strips between the plots, was green and growing September, October, November, half of December, greened up again in mid-March, April. So it's photosynthesizing, it's sequestering carbon from the atmosphere, it's using sunlight, the roots are exuding carbon compounds, feeding the organisms. So Mother Nature has something growing in our Indiana climate for much longer than we typically do in a corn soybean field. And so our rationale is to try to take advantage of that time and have something growing, not that we're going to harvest, just something growing to protect the soil and enrich the soil. So we have a lot of different cover crops, three main categories that we typically think of. They all have different effects. And so part of the work that we do in extension is to help people think through what kind of cover crop do they want and how it fits in their system and that kind of thing. But we have grasses like cereal rye or annual ryegrass or oats or barley or wheat. They have fibrous roots. They're really good for improving soil physical conditions, and they are excellent at scavenging or trapping any nitrogen that might be left in the soil from the previous corn or soybean crop. We have brassicas. The daikon radish is the kind of the popular one right now, but it's not particularly great for improving aggregation of the soil. It does have a long taproot, right? So it can help penetrate shallow compacted layers, and it's a great nitrogen scavenger or trapper of nitrogen as well. And then, of course, we have the legumes like clovers and vetches that will produce nitrogen from the atmosphere. So depending on what your need is, what your goal is, you will have different cover crops that you would be planting. As it turns out, cereal rye is often chosen because it's the most winter hardy and it's the most widely adaptable across northern sections of the Midwest. So we often end up with it, not necessarily that we wouldn't want something else, but if we don't get planted until mid-October, a lot of times it's the only one that's really left that is likely to get established. We do have a project of the Midwest Cover Crops Council that was then done for each state. So this is a joint Midwest Cover Crops Council and Purdue Extension. We call them recipes, and it's basically for those farmers who have decided that they do want to try cover crops, but they're not quite sure where to start. They're a little unsure. These recipes are basically low risk entry phase way to get started with cover crops. And in short, we're basically saying start after corn. When you're going to soybean, use cereal rye, which was the picture I just showed. And then after the soybean, before corn, use oats and radish, which will winter kill, which will make your management easier in the spring before corn. So these are some of the products that the Midwest Cover Crops Council has. We have these for every state in the Midwest now. Very similar, but tweaked a little bit for the conditions in that state. So you can get these either from our Midwest Cover Crops Council site or from Purdue, the Purdue Extension store. This is unabashed advertisement here for the Midwest Cover Crops Council. If you're not familiar with us, please check us out. We have the recipes that I talked about. We have a selector tool, which I didn't have time to talk about today. We have a pocket guide. We're in our 3rd edition. Has a lot of pictures as well as management tips and where different cover crops fit. The Conservation Cropping Systems Initiative website, you can check that out. And then if you're interested in cover crops, you can also Google North Central SARE. I forgot to add a slide about the fact that the MCCC will be hosting our annual meeting this year meaning February 13 and 14, 2004. Write that down, February 13, 14, 2004 in Indianapolis. So we hope that you will come. The last little section I want to talk about is I did do a lot of work on earthworms way back. When we talk about earthworms in agricultural fields, we're really talking about 2 major categories: the deep burrowers, which we all know as night crawlers, and then the shallow dwelling worms, which are known by a variety of names. They're both good. They both do different things. The deep burrowers, as their name implies, build a deep burrow. It may go 3 feet or 4 feet or 5 feet deep, depending on the soil. They pull residues into their mouth of their burrow and feed on them, and then pull some more residues down. So they have more or less a permanent home in this vertical burrow. The shallow dwelling worms live primarily in the topsoil, so primarily the top 8 to 10 inches. They burrow randomly. They eat organic materials and mineral soil as they go. And they go into a little bit deeper and go into a resting stage in the summer and in the winter. If you're going to look at night crawlers, the way that we usually do it is we count those middens. So these mounds of organized residues, and I'm on my hands and knees because that's the way to really be able to tell whether this was just residue that got washed in or whether it was the action of a night crawler. So that's one of the tedious ways that we kind of measure earthworm activity. Just the last couple of slides to again illustrate the breadth of things that a professor type like me gets to do. We do research, which is what I've just been talking about, but extension efforts of all different types. I worked a lot with Barry Fisher from NRCS, recently retired, on soil health. This is that soil health demonstration that I showed you earlier. This is with an Indiana soil. We had drainage research days as we were putting in controlled drainage systems. The intensive soil health training that we conduct every year for our conservation partnership staff is really interesting. My soil physics class, I have about 4 of my labs that we do outdoors with practical techniques that are used in the field. This one is to measure how fast water moves into the soil in a scientifically valid way. So we use our double ring infiltrometer technique here. And then I also get to do a lot of work with graduate students. Most recently, most of them have been somewhat related to cover crops. So I'm out there harvesting cover crops along with them, making lots of observations. And then, of course, we go to scientific meetings and they present posters and talks and so on. So it's great to watch the progression of these young scientists, conservationists, as they progress in their knowledge and expertise. And with that, I think I am ready to take questions or comments or anything else that there might be, and I can probably stop sharing here. So
okay.
Thanks, Matthias. And questions if there are any.
Yeah, so I do have a question for you. So you had talked about the cover crops and also with the over the top of the drainage tiles with that. Did you find an increase of roots in the tile where you had cover crops, or was that kind of a myth, or what's really going on there when you add cover crops to a tiling system?
We have not specifically looked, but we still have water flow. In fact, we have very fast water flow. So we did actually run, it's not a myth. Cover crop roots into tiles sometimes happens. It's very rare. We talk to the tile contractors and they say they have, every year they have certain tiles where there are roots. Sometimes they're corn roots, sometimes they're hay roots, sometimes they're cover crop roots. We did look a couple of times. We took one of those snake type things and it went up the tile drain, and we saw little bits of roots, growing down into the tiles, but nothing big, nothing blocking things. And I don't know that it was any different after we, like I said, we only did it a couple of times, that it was any different after we had done the cover crops compared to before when we hadn't done any cover crops.
Okay. All right. So, well, you did mention the cover crop book. So a lot of the extension offices do have copies of these. I know I've got 5 or 6 here in my office. We'd be more than happy to help you if you are interested in getting a copy of that. We do have another one here. Can you use cover crops in my raised beds or vegetable garden? Which ones would you suggest? Have you done any work with these smaller type areas?
Yeah, great question. You can certainly use cover crops with vegetable gardens. That's my expert answer. Yes. The less expert answer is which one, and because that I'll give you the scientific response. It depends, right? It depends what soil you have. It depends what vegetables you're growing. It depends on the timing of all those. I am less experienced with the vegetable specifics. Our cover crop tool but there are people in Indiana that know more, that have expertise on that related to vegetables and cover crops. Might even be you, Matthias. I don't know, but
Not me.
okay. The master gardener type folks, I think, would be a better bet for suggesting specific cover crops depending on which vegetables and so on you're growing. The other thing is that the cover crop selector tool that we have on the website had a vegetable version of there was the row crop tool and there was a vegetable version. We had some trouble with it on the website, and it's in a long-standing queue to get corrected. So I hope that we will have a vegetable a tool for vegetables sometime in the next year, but that's not going to help you like now. So yeah, I would check with the master gardener, or I think I saw that somebody just put another connection in there.
Yeah, Courtney had put cover crops for the home garden, the publication from Purdue in there.
Okay.
So, and I've also put in a couple other things that you had mentioned, like the link to the drainage study that you mentioned, and also
great.
the link to the Midwest Cover Crops Council as well.
Wonderful.
In that process, we did have another question come in. So drainage tile helps get the field dry to plant sooner, but as we are experiencing more drought conditions midsummer, does it pull the needed water away too soon?
Yeah, that's a great question. The thing to remember about drain tiles is they only remove water until the water table, right? The saturated zone reaches the drain. Once it reaches the drain quits flowing. So any of that moisture that's held a little bit more tightly than saturation in the soil profile above is not affected at all by the presence of the drain. Now, so in general, it's not going to dry the soil out at the time of year when we're typically dry. It just gets us to that condition where the water table's at the drain faster in the spring than would occur otherwise. The only kind of exception to that is if we have soils that have gotten so dry that they've cracked, and then we get a big gully washer type of rain, some of that water will go down the cracks and go into the tile even before the rest of the soil matrix has wetted up. So in that case, controlled drainage or drainage water management is what we're really suggesting to people. And Purdue has research on that in the region, one of those regional projects I was talking about. And that's where people have a box near the end of the tile before it goes into the ditch. And there's like a mini dam in the box. And so you put a couple of boards in that mini dam. And if the water would go into one of those big dry cracks, get into the tile, it stops at the dam, right? And so then that gives a chance for the water that's gotten into the tile to get reabsorbed into the soil. So that's the only place really where the drainage would be an issue in the summer, because it really does not remove water if it's not saturated. I hope that answers that question. It's kind of complicated. I could draw it better, but
Well, to me, it kind of sounds like you've got a tap on the side of a rain barrel or something like that, and the water above it will flows out the drain. But if the tap is above the floor of the barrel, there's still water in that barrel, even though it can't run out. It's kind of, yes, is what it sounds like. So, all right. So, any other questions for Dr. Klaidivko? All right, so I've noticed lots of butterweed in the fields this spring. Sometimes it looks like it is planted purposefully. Is this being done with intention or just natural spreading?
Sorry, what kind of butterweed?
Butterweed is what she's calling it.
I'm not familiar with that being a cover crop. It's certainly not ringing a bell, but there's different common names for different things. So I don't know what. Oh,
crestleaf groundsel.
That's not being planted as a cover crop. However, I have people tell me when I give cover crop talks, almost always some farmer will raise his hand and say, you know, I've got a cover crop. It's called winter annual weeds. So that's not a recommended cover crop, right? But if the idea is to have something growing versus nothing growing, that's the choice that's your choice, right? But yeah, okay. Somebody says it's a native flower. So anyway, that's not a cover crop that we have intentionally planted. Yeah, canola that's yellow now too. I don't know if you've got canola in your area, then certainly that would be, but there's a lot of mustard type weeds that are yellow flowers, and most of those are probably just winter annual weeds and not intentionally planted. But yeah.
Okay. So definitely some great questions here. Keep them coming. So I've got one for you.
Sure.
So you mentioned you just happened to come to Purdue at the right time to get in on this drainage study. What was your intention when you came to Purdue? What did you think you were going to study?
Well, I did get to study the other things. They told me that I could do whatever else I wanted in the general area of soil physical properties. That was my position. And so I did a lot of work with no-till and how that affects soil physical properties. Jerry Mannering and Don Griffith had some long-term plots that I was able to kind of work with them on. And then earthworms as something that was something that I kind of discovered as I was looking at the literature on what's causing no-till to have greater water infiltration rates. Well, earthworms was one part of that. So I did earthworms and I did no-till. Those were the main things I started with. And then I kind of got more into both the drainage and the water quality and cover crops later on. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So John asks, is there a publication on controlled drainage?
Oh, yes. Yes, man. It's a FAQ, water quality. Let's see. One of the places to go would be actually the TD, the Transforming Drainage website. Jane Frankenberger was the lead of that project, but we have a lot of publications there. But we had an FAQ on drainage water management that we developed back in 2006, which I think is still there and is still valid. but if you can go to the Transforming Drainage website, there will be that one plus others. I think.
All right, so I put tools to inform or transform drainage, that publication, authored by Ben Reinhardt,
Ben Reinhardt.
Jane Frankenberger, and a couple others there. I just put that link in the chat as well. So
Yes, yes. And then that, okay, yep. And then that one, I don't know if that, I'm looking at it right now to see. So there's a lot of things on the web, there, controlled drainage suitability tool. I don't know if the FAQ is there as well, but yeah, that would be a great place to start. Yep. Yeah, great. You're quick with that, Matthias. That's great.
and then I think this one also will help.
That's the one.
That's the one. Yep.
WQ 44. Yep, there you go.
Okay.
So that explains the basic practice very well, and then answers some questions about it. So yeah, between those two sites, you ought to be in really good shape.
Yeah. Sounds good. So, all right. Does anyone else have any other questions? Can all the links being added to the chat be sent in the email or otherwise available? Yes, we can make sure. I think Courtney, when she sends out the follow-up email thanking you, she will include those in that email as well. So, and she did confirm they will be available. Okay. And then is there an updated publication on regular tile drainage, spacing, soils, etc.?
Well, the extension articles that I wrote on CPAC are somewhat, although they are specific for that study, there's a little bit on just what do tile drains do, but there is a publication, it's from the year 2000, but it's still fine. It's the one on tile spacing recommendations for Indiana soils. It is by Franzmeyer, who's a retired guy in our department, and then a couple of NRCS folks. I think it's AY 300 and AY 301. Matthias, if you're looking, those are available at the Purdue Extension store. You can't get a hard copy anymore, but it's online. And then if you're looking for a basic, if you have an audience and you're looking for a basic explanation of what is tile drainage, I was asked to write a blog last year and, a blog post about answering that. Yeah. So the one that Matthias just put in there, drainage recommendations for Indiana soils. And essentially it goes through, it puts all the soil types into different drainage classes or drainage categories. And then it gives you some general recommendations for each of those categories. So that is still valid. You may find a soil type that the name wasn't present in the year 2000. So then find the nearest one. Those soil classifiers, they like to change the names for tiny little differences in the soil that most of us would not be aware of, right? So they changed the Chalmers to a Drummer or something like that. So they changed my Claremont soil, which I'd been working with for 25 years, and they changed it to a Cobb's Fork. Oh my gosh, Cobb's Fork. Okay, so just to warn you, you might have to, your favorite soil right now may not be in that book, but you certainly, I'm sure the soil is. You just have to find out what the name was a little earlier. That's all.
Okay, so we did have another question come in. So Jen is asking, is there any particular cover crop recommended for banks along the county regulated drains that runs through fields?
That's a great question. I am not aware of one. That would probably be a perennial. You'd probably want a perennial there. Right?
Possibly. I would also advise you, since it's a county regulated drain, I would advise you to work with the local surveyor and make sure that you can do what you're wanting to do as well. See what the setbacks are if they need something like that. So
Yeah. Yeah, great question.
okay, we've got about 2 more minutes here, but so while we're waiting on the last few questions here, Dr. Klaidivko, see, I can't even say it one time fast. I want to thank you for your time and putting this presentation together, and for sharing your knowledge with us today. Like I said, I know I learned a lot today, and I hope all the participants did as well. Courtney will be sending out a follow-up email with all the links that have been put into the chat today. And along with that, if you guys have any other questions, feel free to reach out to us or your local extension office as well. And we will be more than happy to help you guys out and help you with any problem that you may be having or experiencing at that point in time. So with that, we're going to go ahead and give you about a minute back of your day. And I want to thank you, everybody, for tuning in today to this May edition of the Area 8 A&R Educators Hot Topics. And we look forward to seeing you next month, where I think next month is Dr. Langemeyer coming and talking to us as well. So yeah, Courtney did put into the chat, Dr. Klaidivko was the first female professor in agronomy at Purdue.
Oh.
So thank you for paving the way. So